Google Stadia is such an interesting concept to me. On one hand, it could possibly revolutionize the way we purchase and play games. On the other hand, the entire thing is potentially set up to crash and burn. Is Stadia ahead of its time or just ahead of itself? So what is Google Stadia? To put it simply, Google Stadia is a games as a service platform where instead of buying a physical disc or digital download for a specific piece of hardware, you just buy the game and they stream it to the device you're running the service on. This could be a Chromecast, phone, smart TV, or really anything capable of running a web browser. Google Stadia started off as Project Stream back in October of 2018 when they did a limited beta with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which I released a video on shortly after the service launched. The beta ran until sometime in January, then Google released the full service publicly on November 10th of 2019, but limited to only a handful of compatible devices. Also, you need to buy a Stadia package, which runs about $129 and something I'd only really be willing to invest in if there's any interest in order to use it. Google also offers a Stadia Pro membership, which is a membership similar to Xbox Game Pass or EA Access that gives you access to a handful of free games with more being released regularly. Stadia already received backlash over the system when they launched the service, then immediately offered another 2 games for free that many people had already bought. They offered refunds for the people who already bought those games, but not after leaving a bad taste in many mouths. Still, you need that membership if you want to play games at 4K and 60 frames per second. The cool thing about Stadia is that just from a conceptual standpoint, it's an amazing piece of technology. Really, if this were running in a perfect world, it would solve a lot of the issues present in the gaming industry. First, let's take a look at console hardware. We just had 2 generations with opposite problems. Last generation went on for too long. The Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 released in late 2005 and the PS4 and Xbox One released late 2013, yielding a generation that went on for 8 years without any upgrades, except for very minor model changes to fix things like the red ring of death or to slim down the hardware a bit. Towards the end of the generation, you could see consoles beginning to lag far behind what PC could offer, especially considering graphical mods that started coming out, which likely caused the resurgence of PC gaming in the first half of the decade. On the other hand, while this generation is shaping up to be around equal length with the PlayStation 5 hinting at another 8-year span, there's been a lot of sub-generations since the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One released. The Xbox One released in November 2013. 3 years later, in August of 2016, the Xbox One S released with an upgraded GPU, a new Ultra HD player, as well as 4K and HDR support. Then, a year later in November of 2017, the Xbox One dropped with much better specs and a $500 price tag. PS4 did something similar by releasing the PS4 original in 2013, then the PS4 Pro in 2016, but didn't spring for a high-end model afterward like the Xbox. Sony didn't have as many hardware revisions unless you count the sub-generation CUH7100 and CUH7200, which had the same performance but minor changes in internals. The Stadia would fix all of this since there's no additional hardware required for actually running the games. Maybe there would be an upgraded Chromecast or something down the line, but it wouldn't be the same as buying an entirely new console every few years. Hell, it would even beat out a PC where you can upgrade individual components as you wish and keep the same system at the cutting edge of hardware. The entire process of upgrading and updating hardware for better performance would be on Google, so you could possibly wake up one day and go, hey, this looks a lot better than yesterday. Another part of the console generation changes Stadia would solve is the idea of backwards compatibility. To be fair, PC doesn't really have the same issue as console. Once you buy a game, you just kinda have it and play it. The original Half-Life is old enough to drink, but I can still load it up on my machine without a problem. The only time you really run into any issues with compatibility is 16-bit games, which is difficult to get running on Windows because it lacks a 16-bit subsystem. However, console has a huge issue with this, which was exacerbated with the switch from the PowerPC architecture to x86 during the last generation, or in Sony's case, sell to x86. Xbox One handled this pretty well with a large collection of backwards compatible games, but PS4 has relied on its Stadia-like PlayStation Now system, or I guess I should say Stadia is more of a PlayStation Now-like system since it came out first. Stadia would solve this by just having all games streamed to you. Unless there's a major revelation in computer architecture, x86 is here to stay, so that probably won't be that much of an issue, but it's still somewhat future-proof. Worst case, it's in Google's hands to support both the new and old systems. The lack of dedicated hardware also opens up so many doors for people who can't use or afford it. We saw with the release of the Nintendo Switch that portability is such a huge factor for some people because of long commutes or periods of downtime away from home. As a kid who visited family and went on trips regularly, I would have really loved to Switch when I was a kid. Expanding that concept to pretty much every major title would be enough to get some people to ditch consoles and maybe even PC entirely. Imagine a college student who maybe doesn't want to bring a full rig into their small dorm and can't afford a $1,200 gaming laptop for school, or doesn't want to lug it around between classes. Maybe there's somebody out there that cares about quality but is tired of buying new consoles or computer parts every few years, or just doesn't want to give up the extra space in their house. Maybe there's somebody out there that wants to play on the TV sometimes, but also their phone and laptop and doesn't want a complicated setup of HDMI splitters or switches or constantly be moving hardware around to make it happen. Really, a cloud streaming service for gaming could revolutionize the way we buy and play games. A lot of the problems that we have now wouldn't exist. No more hardware upgrades, no more backwards compatibility. Games would be portable, easy to access, and readily available the minute they launch, all for just the price of the game itself and no headaches associated with owning actual hardware. However, we don't live in a perfect world. We still have our limits. First of all, let's take a look at bandwidth, especially in the United States. Google Stadia requires a minimum of 10 megabits per second in order to use its service, with 4K at 60 frames per second requiring 35 megabits. Now, speed test says that the average internet speed in the United States is right around 96.25 megabits, which would blow that out of the water. However, the average is not indicative of what is actually available. In the same report, they measured the 4K acceptable speed ratio, or ASR, for the 6 fastest providers. ASR is defined as the percentage of fixed broadband download results over 25 megabits per second. The highest was Xfinity at 84.5%, which is a pretty solid ratio of people that actually could stream 4K. However, the bottom 3 on that list scored between 70.6% and 34.6%, which paints a slightly different picture. The truth is, the internet in the United States has come a long way in the second half of this decade. Gigabit fiber has rolled out in a lot of major cities, which has greatly improved speeds. However, as soon as you get out of the metropolitan area, that coverage starts to get a little spotty. Take me, for example. I live less than half an hour away from a city that constantly advertises gigabit speeds. However, I'm still rocking a 30x3 connection on VDSL. According to my ISP, the maximum I can get where I live at the moment is 50 megabits per second down. For rural Americans, it's even worse. Pew Research has shown that when discussing access to broadband internet, rural Americans are 12 percentage points less likely to own a home broadband connection, with 24% saying that high-speed internet access is a major problem for them, an issue that even spans income gaps. That's not even considering that data caps exist. A 35 megabit stream would burn through a 1 terabyte cap in about 62 hours, or roughly 15 hours a week. And that doesn't even factor in the data that you're using on top of Stadia. Throw in Netflix or Hulu at 4K, some general web browsing, or somebody else using the service in your house, and your monthly allowance would go pretty quickly. On top of that, you have to consider reliability as well. Internet infrastructure is pretty redundant in the United States, with outages not being a recurring thing for most people. I worked at a data center a while ago that had a 4 nines SLA, or a guarantee of 99.99% uptime, which is roughly 5 minutes a month of downtime. After that, they would generally start crediting people for the downtime. However, circuits still go down, power outages happen. At some point you will go, oh, I can't play anything right now because somebody cut a fiber in Georgia. Or I can't play anything right now because there's a power outage in Virginia. Oh, by the way, I'm in Tennessee. There would be a little bit of redundancy that would alleviate most of that, but your library's availability is still basically up to your ability to access a certain web page. Also, remember when Xbox Live and PSN were down for like all of December a few years back? Imagine your entire library being down for that long. To be fair, you're relying on a company with such a high uptime that it makes the news when one of its websites goes down. I think the most important question to ask that I don't see a lot of people asking is what happens if Stadia shuts down? Google has an awful history when it comes to keeping services afloat. This year alone saw at least 19 different Google services get shut down. Google Allo, Hangouts, Hangouts on Air, even YouTube Gaming is gone. Stadia is expensive to run. From an initial standpoint, it seems like all you'd have to do is go to a data center and start filling it up with gaming machines, but that's not true. What happens if a data center goes down? Well, then you have to build a backup just in case. What about latency? Well, now you have to build a few more across your service area. Stadia already has a problem with that since it's currently unavailable in Hawaii and Alaska. And it's not the same equipment that you would need to host a web server. That's cheap. Video streaming is a little bit more expensive, but Stadia is even more than that. Imagine rebuilding YouTube, which costs millions to billions of dollars a year to run, but throwing even more overhead on top of that by actually running games on it. So, what happens if, let's say, Google spends all this money building infrastructure for Stadia? They make sure everyone in the United States can enjoy 4K 60 frames per second games streamed directly to their house, and nobody just buys it. They try to offer some discounts, maybe throw out some free weekends to get people interested, and just nobody takes the bait. Maybe they consider the first year almost a loss leader, just putting it out there completely operational to get people's interest. But the second year comes around and it still doesn't catch on. Finally they decide, hey, this is extremely expensive to run and it's not working, so they decide to close their doors. Well, Stadia's director Andrei Dornichev said that we would be able to take our game's metadata away on day one. Okay, that's cool, but I didn't buy my game's save. I bought the game itself. I don't care if I get to keep every save I ever do in these games. I paid full price for a bunch of games that I just don't get to play anymore, and that's a problem. Sure, it exists with digital downloads, but this is even worse. So I guess it's time for the final questions. Is Stadia technically feasible? Really, it depends on what you consider feasible. Can we stream 4K 60 frame per second video to people's houses? Absolutely. Can we do it at a reasonable quality? If you put aside the fact that they have already been caught up scaling games to 4K instead of running them natively, then I guess you could say so. The games really don't look bad and they play pretty well. At least they did in the beta. There's a few hiccups, and even though I wouldn't trust it enough for a competitive multiplayer game, it's perfectly acceptable for single-player games. Now for the more important question for Google, is Stadia commercially feasible? Really, that's just something we'll have to wait and see. On one hand, there is a large market of people that Stadia would appeal to. Think about how much the portability of the Switch led to its success. People want to play Skyrim on the can. Imagine being able to do that, but with pretty much every major title in the future and without having to buy an extra piece of hardware that costs hundreds of dollars. Really, for somebody that's constantly on the go, a Switch and Stadia combo would do amazing. The infrastructure is there and it's constantly improving. However, Stadia is taking a gamble. We've seen that even though the average internet speed in the United States would be able to run Stadia just fine, the actual availability of 4K ready bandwidth isn't universal. Plus, relying on a constant 4K stream for all of your gaming would eat up a data cap pretty quickly. The outcome that they're hoping for is that there is enough people out there that can support it that will buy it. However, it's really hard to say how big that group of people is. So, is Stadia just ahead of its time? Honestly, in a way it is. If Google delayed the release of Stadia by just a couple of years, they would probably have a lot easier time selling it. More people would have access to higher bandwidth, and thus their customer base would be bigger. However, there's a problem with Stadia that isn't really about the technology. Why should I buy this service? As it currently stands, if you want to buy a Stadia game, you have to buy the Premier Edition that comes with a Chromecast Ultra as well as a controller, which runs about $129. The games that are available at the moment are games that have already released, meaning that if they were anything that really piqued your interest, you'd most likely be buying them again. And it's not even just recent titles, but stuff that's been out for years. Why would I want to buy a $130 bundle just to play a game I got for free when I built a PC back in like 2013? So, do you want to spend almost $200 to play a single game that you already own, but maybe on your phone sometimes? Now, this is subject to change. Eventually, you probably won't need the bundle, plus they're already offering some games free with their Pro membership. They already have a few major releases planned for Stadia, including Cyberpunk 2077 and Doom Eternal, which is nice. However, what is the draw? Sure, being able to play a game anywhere you like without having to install anything is nice and a really cool concept. However, what is going to draw people over from Xbox, PS4, and PC? What, besides curiosity, is going to make somebody go out right now and buy a Stadia package? The Switch cost twice as much as the bundle, and people still bought them in droves, along with a game that had already been out for 6 years. Did people buy Switches just to play Skyrim on the train? No, they also bought the first-party exclusives that came out for the Switch, as well as the ones Nintendo marketed in the future. Right now, Stadia has nothing over any console when it comes to games. There's no exclusives, there's no extra features outside of cloud streaming. It's just, hey, buy these games that you already own and maybe a couple that you're planning on later that are also on systems you already have. Don't worry, there's exclusives coming out later with a bunch of cool features. I know we haven't shown any, but they're there, we promise, I swear. Usually, consoles get announced right along with exclusives, because why else would you buy it? If the Xbox One came out and just told everybody to rebuy a bunch of Xbox 360 games for the new system and maybe hold out for some other games that they can get on another system that they already own, do you think people would have bought it? Absolutely not, because there wouldn't have been a point. You could have just kept what you had in the first place. The work for releasing a new system isn't over when the hardware is done. You have to work with developers to give people a reason to want to buy the new hardware when it comes out. Stadia has done absolutely nothing. They haven't named anything, they haven't shown anything. They said there's going to be exclusives and they'll be able to do these things that other systems just can't do, but they haven't brought anything tangible to the table. Who knows if they really exist? Who can bank on that enough to spend $129 on a hardware bundle? So, to conclude, is the Stadia technically feasible? Yeah, sure. The hardware's there, the software's there, it works, and it's actually viable. Streaming games directly to thin clients is something that we have the ability to do now to the point that we can actually sell a service for it, and the potential customer base is only going to keep growing. Is the Stadia commercially feasible? Maybe. There might be enough interest to keep it afloat for a bit, and maybe Google has enough set aside to hold it off until it picks up. However, the answer to that question is really reliant on the last question. Is Stadia ahead of its time? From a technical standpoint, maybe. While we can say there's people out there that the system works for, it's really hard to gauge how big that potential base is. Logically, the best time to release it would be any time except right now, because that group of people is only going to grow. However, I think the success is more reliant on whether or not Stadia is ahead of itself more than technology in general. Google released a hardware bundle for a service that was poorly advertised and poorly thought out. They put the horse before the cart in an industry where the cart comes first. People buy systems to play games, not the other way around. Right now, Stadia's success is dependent on Google's ability to take control of the narrative and start pushing out reasons to actually use this. Release some known games for it, maybe offer some trials or add them to a pro membership, push out some exclusives or at least show us what's in the work to give us an incentive to buy this. Show us why we should invest in this system. If Google wants Stadia to succeed, they need to do it now, because this is really work that they should have done months ago. Whether or not Stadia lives is completely up to how fast Google can turn this ship around before it's too late. So what do you guys think? Are we really ready for Stadia, and is Stadia really ready for us?